My new interactive experience, Project PCI, similar to a Choose Your Own Adventure, will be released tomorrow at midday Central, here on the Metatron's channel. I hope you check it out. Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I would like to talk about historical people whom, according to the research that we have done and the sort of sources we have reviewed, appear to have been actually gay. Hey, welcome back. Just as a small disclaimer and clarification, did you notice that I put the word gay in quotations? Well, the reason I did that is because, of course, when I say that someone was gay, for example, in classical antiquity, the word that we're using needs to be placed in its real historical context. And history is why this video exists. This isn't made because we particularly care who slept with whom, but we are interested in the human experience, correctly contextualized in period, to fully grasp the anthropological notion and give further depth to historical people we all know. Now, as you know, on this channel I've focused several times on debunking when activists are trying to push history that is incorrect, such as, for example, several articles that were trying to push the idea that Hadrian's Wall was some kind of gay icon, or that Elagabalus was a transgender emperor who even had his own preferred pronouns. But since my aim is always to show the truth for what it is, today we're doing the other way around. We're looking at characters and people that most likely were same-sex attracted. They were gay, and it's important, I think, to underline this for a correct exemplification of fact based on the sources. But of course, their experience would have been completely different, and even their mentality would have been completely different to what we have today. With that established, let's jump onto the first historical person. First, I would like to talk about Michelangelo. Now, I don't think I really need to introduce the man, but whatever. Sculptor, painter, poet who lived between 1400s and the 1500s, and he's probably the undisputed protagonist of the Italian Renaissance. His most famous works, such as David, the Pietà, and the Last Judgment, are immortal cornerstones of art history. Michelangelo was born in Caprese, Tuscany, and he grew up in Florence, where he had the opportunity to study under the guidance of eminent artists of the time and immerse himself in humanistic culture, thanks in particular to an invitation from Lorenzo de Medici. In this context, Michelangelo was introduced to classical art, which profoundly influenced his style and conception of art itself. Moreover, he had the chance to study with some of the greatest intellectuals of the Renaissance, such as the Neoplatonic philosopher Marsilio Ficino and the poet Angelo Poliziano. Now, after Lorenzo de Medici's death in 1492, Michelangelo continued to work in Florence under the patronage of other important families like the Borgia. In 1496, he moved to Rome, where he created some of his main works, such as the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel. Now, don't get me wrong, much has been written about Michelangelo's sexuality, particularly in the way he would depict or represent the male nude body. And there are some people who allege the possibility that even when he represented female nudes, he still used male models. Now, even though it might appear strange, this hypothesis is supported by the physical appearance of the women in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, with their robust and muscular build and vigorous arms. Now, of course, we need to go beyond these artistic speculations in order to present or build a reasonable case, and we're gonna do that with the usage of Michelangelo's self-orthographed writings. A first reference is related to one of the many epitaphs written for the death of Cecchino Bracci, his pupil. In the postscript of Epitaph 197, handwritten and unpublished until 1960, Michelangelo proposed an ambiguous alternative for the last two verses that had raised many questions about the exact relationship between Michelangelo and Cecchino. Let's have a look. So what we're reading now is my script for this video, and we see in this part, this is the original, and it says: La carne terra, e qui l'ossa mie, prive dell'orbegli occhi e del leggiadro aspetto, fan fede a quel chi fu grazia e diletto, in carcer quaggiù, l'anima vive. So, Michelangelo proposed an alternative ending. Fan fede a quel chi fui grazia nel letto, che abbracciava, en che l'anima vive. So what we are seeing here, or what's being revealed, is that in the wordplay, the attachment to his pupil seems to have evidently had romantic implications. Now, with that being said, the one single relationship that appears to be the most indicative when it comes to Michelangelo's alleged homosexuality would be the one that he had with Tommaso de' Cavalieri. You see, in December 1532, the sculptor Pier Antonino Cecchini introduced Michelangelo to a young 23-year-old, a member of Roman nobility, Tommaso de' Cavalieri. Michelangelo was overwhelmed by the encounter, and something clicked inside him so much that he felt the urgency to keep in touch with the Cavalieri. Between 1532 and 1564, the artist wrote an infinite number of letters declaring to the young man a wave of feelings that went well beyond friendship. Let's have a look. Come se creduto m'avesse passare con le piante asciutte un piccol fiume, ovvero per poca acqua un manifesto guado, ma poi che partito sono dalla spiaggia, non che picciol fiume abbia trovato, ma l'oceano con soprastante onde, m'è apparito innanzi, tanto che se potessi, per non essere intucto da quelle sommerso, alla spiaggia, ond'io, prima partì volentieri, mi ritornerei. So this is what Michelangelo writes in order to describe the encounter with Tommaso de' Cavalieri, in a way comparing it to a watercourse, a river, that is only small and controllable at first, but gradually becomes a vast and ungovernable open sea. And also let's keep in mind that in Michelangelo's own words, the name Tommaso is the one name that the artist cannot get out of his head, and he says as if it had become part of his own body. In Michelangelo's words, we read: Non credo che voi crediate che io abbia dimenticato o possa dimenticare il cibo di che io vivo, che non è altro che il nome vostro. So what Michelangelo feels is a restless and urgent sentiment that needs constant confirmation. The Cavalieri himself at first keeps his distance. He reciprocates his beautiful words with detachment and control, then becomes increasingly flattered and returns the affection until he comes to define Michelangelo as, open quotes, my unique Lord. And in the future times to come, Michelangelo will send some drafts of his own works to Cavalieri, including the artwork of Ganymede, for which it is possible that Tommaso was the model. The sonnets themselves sent to the young man by Michelangelo are a clear sign of his love, and not only that, in one in particular we catch the nuance that the relationship between the two was perhaps the subject of malicious gossip, which of course shouldn't surprise us considering the fact that we are in the late medieval period and in the Renaissance. Once again we read, I see in your beautiful face, my lord, what can hardly be narrated in this life. The soul, still clothed in flesh, has already ascended to God, with it several times. So that merciful source from which we all come gathers all beauty that is seen here more than anything else to discerning people. We have no other sign, nor are the fruits of heaven on earth, and he who loves you with faith transcends to God and makes death sweet. Now, of course, once again, this is the mind of a late medieval, of a Renaissance Italian. So of course there will be a very strong connection to religion. And even though this wouldn't have been common at all in the period in Italy, in the mind of Michelangelo, a representation of male beauty, particularly when invigorated with sentiment, was a reference to the divine in his ability to create as a master artist. Now let's discuss the second historical persona, Jean II of Orleans. In 1098, in Orleans, the appointment of a rather extraordinary character as bishop was ratified, sparkling reactions from the clergy, who were divided between spite and hilarity. Jean II, nephew of the Cluniac abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, who was already an archdeacon of Tours, ascended to the episcopal see of Orleans. Now let's just say that the religious investiture of Jean II wasn't particularly based on faith, shall we say, but it was in fact something that had a political nature, because it was highly desired by Philip I, King of France. You see, King Philip I wasn't particularly liked by the clergy of his time and his geographic location. To explain this a little better, let's just put it this way. He had been living with a concubine, and this concubine was the legitimate wife of another man. So you can clearly imagine that in 1092, it's not like the clergy is gonna like that very much, so he had been vehemently denounced by the ecclesiastical authorities of that area. But in 1094, he finds a potential ally, which was the young and relatively manipulable ecclesiastic Jean II. Although Jean II's exact age at the time of his investiture is not known, it's clear from the sources that he was not yet 30, and therefore decidedly too young to be a bishop. His investiture, which took place on December 28th, the third day of what was known as the Feast of the Innocents, or Feast of Fools, lent itself to scathing criticism. For context, the Feast of the Innocents was a sort of carnival, shall we say, that had direct connections to the Roman Saturnalia. And during these festivities, it was actually customary at the time to take a young prelate and dress him in fake ecclesiastical vestments, in a way to have a little bit of a parody of a bishop, if you will. So this actual election that happened was taken as a joke by the canons, and this was of course humiliating to the king. We read in Latin, Eligimus puerum, meaning we elect an innocent. In this context, it means a child. Puerorum festa colentes, while celebrating the feast of the innocents. Non nostrum morem, so not according to our customs, sed regis iussa sequentes, but following the will of the king. Alright, now, give me a second of your time, because I'm really excited. So I would like to take a moment to mention the sponsor that made this video possible, but it's HelloFresh. HelloFresh. I've been using HelloFresh for 4 years, never mind, oh, he got sponsored, so no. I'm a massive fan of HelloFresh, so I'm really excited that they're now sponsoring the video. In fact, they did send me a box. Hey, look at what we've got. See if I can pick it up. Yeah, whoa, look at this. Alright, let's open it up. Oh, that's nice. Pasta primavera, sweet corn and green peppers chowder, creamy mushroom spaghetti with burrata. So it's kind of funny because since I'm already subscribed, so I got the box because of the sponsorship, but then I already had a box because I've got a lot of HelloFresh to cook this month, so yeah, let's go cook something. Now, I do want to share how much my wife and I absolutely enjoy HelloFresh. We have been using this for many years and we love it. And oftentimes, of course, whenever pasta is available, you know me. Buon appetito. Man, HelloFresh is fantastic. Now, HelloFresh provides you lots of different options to, support your journey, whether it be wellness journey or you're just trying to make sure you eat healthy. And you can literally dig into the biggest menu yet with over 50 dinner options and even more market items that can suit your personal lifestyle. You can customize your delivery week by week depending on if you're getting busy. If you're a vegetarian, they've got options for you. And of course, keeping in mind that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Everybody says that, and clearly HelloFresh agrees. In fact, they are giving all subscribers free breakfast for life. As a couples activity, it's the greatest thing ever. So I massively suggest to try HelloFresh out. Super real review from me. Absolutely love the service. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below and use my code METATRONSEP10 and get 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box while subscription is active if you are in the US. Outside the US, the local discount will apply. And of course, by clicking the link in the description, you will also help supporting this channel, and I'm sure you'll love it. And thank you very much to HelloFresh for sponsoring my video. Certainly, Jean II was very young, but he doesn't seem to have been properly innocent, at least in the strictest sense of the term. There is another reason, according to the medieval record, as to why this investiture triggered the ecclesiastical authorities so much. And that is the fact that Jean II was actually famous, or should we say infamous at the time, because of his licentious conduct. In other words, he was being openly homosexual. Now, you might think he's in the church against homosexuals in the medieval period. Yes, they were, but he had connections. So it's not like the church can just burn at the stake any member of nobility, however they want. But they did make fun of him, and they did give him a nickname, Flora. Flora was an ancient deity of pagan Rome, patron of buds, to whom the Romans had dedicated the Floralia festival from April 28th to May 3rd. And to discourage her cult for denigrating purposes, the 3rd century AD Christian writer Lactantius had argued that Flora was originally a prostitute, and that the Romans had instituted the festivals in her honor to thank her for having bequeathed her assets to the people. So, when you read the term or the word Flora or the nickname Flora within medieval ecclesiastical circles of cultured ecclesiastics, then it was basically a synonym for prostitute. In an enraged letter to Pope Urban II, the Archbishop Ivo of Chartres reports the following. During the Christmas festivities, this Jean obtained from the king the appointment to the bishopric of Orléans, who, amid the murmurs of scandal of all, had already been made archdeacon. The King of France knows him well, however, because not in secret, but publicly, he told me himself that this Jean had had infamous complacencies for the deceased bishop, and this bad conduct is so public throughout the bishopric of Orléans and in neighboring cities that his fellow canons call him nothing but Flora, name of a famous prostitute. What I tell you here, the entire clergy would confirm. The people would proclaim, if if they were not held back by fear of the king or by the schemes of the Archbishop of Tours. Now, continuing to read, we'll get a summary of his sins. Let's go. To give you a brief summary of his faults, he is an infamous person and of an indecent familiarity with the Archbishop of Tours and his deceased brother, as well as with many others who live in indecency, divulged in the most shameful way in all the cities of France. In fact, some of his lovers have composed numerous songs about him that praise Flora, which are sung everywhere by depraved youths in the cities of France, in squares and at crossroads, and he himself has not been ashamed to sing them sometimes and to hear them sung before him. Now, we have many references to Jean II's homosexuality, and they cannot be ignored. But in this specific case, it is also possible that the strong critique, or should we say fierce criticism by Ivo of Chartres, was mostly directed at the fact that Jean was King Philip's man, whom was placed within the ecclesiastical structure for control purposes. So in other words, even though we have a lot of mentions when it comes to the sexual inclinations of the young man, in this specific case, this specific letter should be read as a struggle for the difference in political power between state and church. The next historical character we're gonna dive into is King Edward II. Son of Edward I Longshark, the Hammer of the Scots, Edward II Plantagenet, King of England from 1307 to 1327, is probably familiar to many for his portrayal in the film Braveheart by actor Peter Hanley. Now, in the film, Edward II is presented as submissive, weak, effeminate character with a ephebic physique, in total contrast to his strong, resolute, cunning and fierce father. Now, in reality, actual contemporary sources of the medieval period described Edward II quite differently, at least when it comes to his physical appearance. In the Vita Eduardi II, which was written by a canon contemporary of the king, we read that he was, open quotes, tall and strong, a fine figure of a handsome man. Another contemporary, Sir Thomas Gray, in the Scala Chronica reports that Edward II was, open quotes, physically one of the strongest men in the realm. And further sources insist on this detail, as we read, open quotes, a well-formed and handsome person. There exists also a description of the monarch at age 16, which was written by an eyewitness during the siege of Calerock in 1300s, and the poet writes, a handsome man, strong of body and limb. From an anonymous from 1330 we read, elegant, of outstanding strength. In the Gesta Eduardi de Carnarvon from 1330 we read, open quotes, fair of body and great strength. And from the Polychronicon in 1350 we read, fair of body and great of strength. Now, there is no reason not to believe these sources. At the end of the day, this is a member of nobility, and we have to remember that there is a massive difference when it comes to dietary habits and even access to certain foods for medieval nobility, particularly when compared to the general population. So it's not strange that even at age 16, a medieval nobleman who had access to all sorts of foods, particularly in Northern Europe, would have been more developed than, say, the rest of the population, which would have created a stark contrast that, of course, poets would have noticed. Another thing that medieval nobility had access to was martial training, in fact, constant martial training, and even other forms of sporting practices such as hunting and horseback riding, which would have definitely had an effect in the growth of the body and even length of the limbs. Moreover, if he had inherited his father's build, which there is no reason not to think so, this would have contributed as well. Edward I was called Longsharks, remember, and his remains, exhumed and examined towards the end of the 18th century, were those of a man almost 6 feet and 2 inches tall, so about 1.90 m. Another thing that seems to be very different from the way he was portrayed in the movie Braveheart was his temperament, his personality. He wasn't soft and submissive. In fact, during the Scottish campaigns of 1300 and 1306, we read that he successfully carried out several military operations. However, one element implied by Mel Gibson's film seems to have some historical basis: Edward's homosexuality. It is in 1326 that Adam Orleton, Bishop of Hereford, allegedly accused Edward II of being, open quotes, tyrannus et sodomita, which means tyrant and sodomite, and of course sodomite meaning homosexual in this context. To give you full context, however, it is important to underline that this specific mention was in fact coming to us through a man by the name of John Pricker, who was a clergyman opposed to Orleton, and Bishop Orleton later denied the accusation. So it may have been a case of political maneuvering whereby he was trying to get the bishop basically executed by the king, sort of accusing him of, slander and defamation. However, many years later, in 1390, Abbot Thomas Burton of Moor Abbey in East Yorkshire wrote that, open quotes, Eduardus in vitio sodomitico nimium delectabat, which translates, Edward excessively delighted in the vice of sodomy. So there we go, we got now 2 mentions, even if the first one was denied, we have a second. In addition to the rumours about Edward II's homosexuality, there was a relationship the king had, even when he was still a prince, with Piers Gaveston, a knight from Gascony from a family loyal to the Plantagenets, who had arrived at Edward's first court in 1300. A decisively peculiar character, in 1306, Piers Gaveston had attracted Edward I's wrath by abandoning the Scottish campaign along with other knights to participate in a tournament, for which he was temporarily imprisoned. Now, in a sort of plot twist, if you will, what's interesting is that by 1307, Gaveston had actually gained Edward II's favour, and the young prince actually asked his father to give Gaveston the county of Ponthieu in France. According to the 14th century historian Walter of Gisborough, the proposal had provoked an enraged reaction from Edward I, who allegedly assaulted his son, tearing out entire locks of his hair before kicking him out of the throne room. Subsequently, the king would exile Gaveston. We don't exactly know 100% why King Edward I had such a overreaction towards this request. Maybe it was due to a sort of antipathy that he had against the man Gaveston because of the fact that he had left the Scottish campaign. Or maybe, just maybe, the violent reaction had to do with the fact that perhaps the king knew about the possible relationship that had begun between Gaveston and his son Edward II. Because you see, in a historical context of the period, if this was the classical period, classical antiquity, then a king wouldn't necessarily care, particularly in the West, about his son playing around with other young men as long as he gets married and gives him an heir. But this is the medieval period, so now there is the influence of Christianity, which is extremely strong in the medieval period, as I have mentioned on the dedicated video, how strong was the medieval church. You can find a link in the description below. And therefore, at this time, it is very fitting for the man to react like this, considering he was a son of his time. And in this period, it was not pardoned for the prince to have homosexual relationships. On the other hand, we read from chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, who was contemporary to Edward, that, open quote, upon looking on him, meaning Gaveston, the son of the king immediately felt such love for him that he entered into a covenant of constancy and bound himself with him before all other mortals with a bond of indissoluble love, firmly drawn up and fastened with a knot. So, since we do have this historical mention, it is very likely that that was the reason why King Edward I reacted the way he did. Upon the death of Edward I, the relationship between Edward II, now king, and Gaveston seems to have been incredibly close, variously interpreted by historians as either an actual romantic bond or a very deep friendship, bordering on platonic love. Now, certainly, the favours bestowed by Edward II on Gaveston, from the earldom of Cornwall to the regency of the kingdom, seems to go beyond those of a simple friendship, and were so numerous as to exasperate the English nobility, who were also irritated by Gascon's arrogant attitude, eventually forcing the king to temporarily exile him. Gaveston's return from exile, followed by some setbacks in the war against Scotland, ended up leading the English barons to open revolt, led by the king's cousin Thomas Plantagenet. All of this terminating or culminating in 1312 with the death, so the killing at the hands of these nobles of Gaveston, so Edward II's friend, while at the same time trying to force the king to swear not to try and take revenge due to the death of his friend / possible lover. It is quite likely that this was in fact a lover, not just a friend, is because Edward's II reign seems to have been characterized by a sort of recurring pattern, so to speak. In 1318, a new figure appears on the scene, that of Hugh Despenser the Younger, son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, Earl of Warwick. Like Gaveston, Hugh Despenser the Younger gains Edward's favour, obtaining more and more privileges at court, which he exploits for personal prestige and gain. As with Gaveston, Despenser would also be exiled under pressure from the nobles, only to return and pursuing an arrogant policy, as if repeating previous events, which led to a new uprising, this time led by Edward's second wife, Isabella of France, and Roger Mortimer, Earl of March. Defeated and captured, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III, but Despenser met a much worse fate. And as we read in the chronicles of Jean Froissart, which were written between 1373 and 1400, we read that Hugh Despenser was in fact hanged, drawn, and quartered. If you want to know more about that method of execution, I've got a dedicated video, link in the description. And in the description we are told that his private parts were cut and removed because of an accusation of being a heretic and a sodomite, even, it was said, with the king. Now, the next historical character we're going to discuss might be a little controversial, because we're going to talk about Sappho. Now, I 100% understand that there are people that disagree with this take, and they think, no, Sappho was straight. I accept that, that's your take. In fact, let me know if that's what you think in the comments below, and I'm aware that there are videos that do this, and I myself in the past have made a video where I sort of kept it as a maybe. I said, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. But we looked into it more deeply, and we found some evidence that we believe sort of present this idea more firmly that in fact she was not straight. Now, once again, let me present you the evidence, and then if you have counter arguments, please be civil and let us know what you think. But this is what my team and I have found about Sappho. Born in Eresus, a small town of the island of Lesbos, Sappho was born into a noble family around 630 BC. We don't know under what circumstances, but from some fragmentary classical sources, specifically the Marmorparium, which seems to be confirmed by Ovid, we learn that for a certain period she had to leave the island with her loved ones and take refuge in Sicily. Hey, Sicilian here, represent! Now, it was clear whether this was due to exile or to escape the consequence of a struggle for supremacy among those who aspired to the title of Tyrant of Lesbos. However, upon returning to Lesbos, Sappho's family settled in the main center of the island, Mytilene. Now, regardless of her life, Sappho's most famous aspect is her poetry. And it is in fact a poetic production which has reached us in multiple fragments that she managed to sort of build a prominent position, taking on a sort of didactic or educational role. And this happened within the Thiassos, a circle with collegiate and religious characteristics, specifically referring to the figure of Aphrodite. Now, associations of girls and women were found in Greece since the 7th century BC, and among these, Thiassos is undoubtedly the most famous. But the most credible position among scholars is that Sappho at this time was in charge or leading a community where girls and women were taught lessons in elegance and grace. Participants entered before marriage, completing a period of instructions and preparation which ended at the time of marriage, with the consequent separation from the group. The training included learning women's work, good education, music, and an initiation into sex. And in a way, there was a connection when it comes to two specific goddesses, Artemis and Aphrodite, in the sense that from a wild state of adolescence proper to Artemis, the girls passed to the status of women who inspire love, developing sensuality and sexuality according to the model of Aphrodite. The development of homoerotic relationship within Sappho's Thiassos and other similar circles is still the subject of debate, as we were saying, among scholars, and Sappho's figure was incredibly discussed even in antiquity itself. And that is the reason why I sort of started this point with the fact that it is indeed controversial, because this whole debacle has been going on since the freaking classical period. Now, Sappho is transmitted by classical sources with an incredible duality. If in one hand the Greek and Roman world seems to recognize her exceptionality in her artistic production, so much so as to sometimes simply indicate her as the poetess, where the poet was used to indicate Homer, already 100 years after her death, between the 5th and 4th century BC, Sappho appears as a character in some Athenian comedies, characterized by marked licentiousness and adherence to love triangles that see her in the company of different men. Then, the legend of Sappho, promoted by Meander, ends with her removing her own life by throwing herself off the cliffs of the island of Lefkada because of a situation of an unrequited love from the boatman Phaon. It is the late sources from the 1st centuries after Christ that introduce the subject of her homosexuality, from Maximus of Tyre, who presents it without apparent moral judgment, to the Oxyrhynchus papyri, which report how Sappho had been accused of having illicit relationships with the young women she educated. Finally, finally, it is in the Byzantine Suda that we find a synthesis of all of this conflict and confusion when it comes to the news transmitted by the ancients. If, at the same time, we read that some had attributed to her unruly conduct and being a woman who loved other women, with the word ginaike rastria. At the same time, we find cited the name of her supposed husband, a certain Circilas of the island of Andros, clearly a parodic play on words, since translated it means Mr. Prick from the island of Man. So now, after reading all of this, we're faced with a mass of conflicting information, which makes it difficult to separate the historical figure of Sappho from the legendary one. The references to licentiousness, participation in love triangles with multiple men, and even the farcical reference to the name of a supposed husband probably should be traced not so much to the historical figure of Sappho, but to her having become archetypal of the island of Lesbos, whose inhabitants, well before her, had lascivious reputation. In the Iliad, Agamemnon promises Achilles, if he returns to fight, slaves from Lesbos, and in Greek this word indicates to give pleasure to man, with the mouth in a sensual way. In fact, they call lesbiades prostitutes. Finally, the Greek term to indicate an artificial simulacrum. So this idea that we have a little bit of an artificial Sappho, which was more connected with the legend, including of the island where she was from, has been originated by Aelian, according to whom two different women named Sappho lived in Lesbos, the famous poetess and a prostitute. Here we go. One more theory. Equally artificial appears the myth, handed down by Menander and reported by Ovid, of her offering herself for love of Phaon. This is in fact considered a fabrication already by Strabo. In fact, not only was the boatman Phaon a well-known mythological character, by the way, and an old man rejuvenated and made beautiful by Aphrodite, but the idea of jumping off the cliff for love, specifically of the island of Lefkada in itself, was a consolidated myth, whose protagonist is Cephalus, son of Deionius. So perhaps when we're trying to discern Sappho's sexuality, rather than reading other classical authors, we should read Sappho herself. For instance, with her poem and her meter, which not by chance Horace will define as masculine. In fragment 16, Sappho expresses her nostalgia for one of her students named Anactoria, comparing her feeling to that of Helen for Paris. We read, "Some say the most beautiful thing over the coal black earth is an army arrayed with horses and armor. I say the most beautiful thing over the coal black earth is whatever you love and desire the most." Easy it is to make this clear, for Helen, far besting all mortals in beauty, left the best of all men. Passion drove her, sailing away, nor did she remember her parents or children on her way to far Troy. And now check this out. Now she, my Anactoria, has also gone away. My preference would be to see the supple way she walks and her bright, sparkling face than armies of chariots or foot soldiers in arms. Similarly explicit is fragment 31, in which Sappho expresses her jealousy for the man who laughs and jokes with one of her students, probably her betrothed. We read, "That man seems to me to be equal to the gods, who is sitting opposite you and hears you nearby speaking sweetly, and laughing delightfully, which indeed makes my heart flutter in my breast, for when I look at you, even for a short time, it is no longer possible for me to speak, but it is as if my tongue is broken, and immediately a subtle fire has run over my skin. I cannot see anything with my eyes, and my ears are buzzing. A cold sweat comes over me, trembling seizes me all over. I am paler than grass, and I seem nearly to have died." That's jealousy right there, 100%. All in all, beyond all of the possible elucubrations and the difficult and contradictory framework of the ancient sources, it is indeed Sappho's own magnificent poetry that in a way explicitly declares her feelings and her sexuality, which not by chance have led over time in the modern age to use the term such as sapphic love and lesbian, although undoubtedly the parable of this term, from prostitute, licentious woman to homosexual woman, is certainly curious. Alright, number ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. It was probably a little long, but let me know what you think, and also if you disagree with some of my takes, feel free to write down counter arguments. As I always say, all we do here is to seek the truth. So if you have counter-arguments that are based on documented facts, not feelings. We do not care about feelings, but if you have documented facts, absolutely present them and we will review them as a team. But if you enjoyed this video and you want me to continue, let me know, because I could turn this into a series and I would be more than happy to do so. Thank you so much for watching as always, and thank you for your support. Also, don't forget to check out the amazing offer HelloFresh has for you through the link in the description below. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.